First thing I heard was beeping. Not my alarm, not my phone. Something steadier, more insistent, like a metronome that didn't care whether I lived or died. I tried to open my eyes and the light hit me like a slap. White ceiling, fluorescent tubes. The smell of antiseptic so sharp it burned the back of my throat. A hospital. I was in a hospital. My mouth tasted like copper and dry cardboard. My left arm felt like someone had driven a spike through it. I turned my head slowly because even that small movement sent a wave of nausea rolling through me, and I saw my mother sitting in a plastic chair beside the bed, her coat still on, her purse in her lap, her eyes red and swollen. She was already looking at me. The moment our eyes met, something shifted in her face. Not relief exactly. Something more calculated than relief. She reached over and pressed her fingers gently over my hand, and then she shook her head. Just once. A tiny, barely perceptible shake. "Don't," she mouthed. "Don't let them know you're awake?" I didn't understand, but I knew my mother. I'd known her for 31 years. I knew the difference between her worried face and her afraid face, and what I was looking at right now was the afraid face. So I closed my eyes again. And I listened. The door opened maybe 2 minutes later. I heard heels on the linoleum, the specific click of expensive shoes, and then a voice I recognized immediately. My mother-in-law, that particular pitch she used when she was performing composure, the one that sounded like warmth if you didn't know her well enough to hear the edges underneath. "Any change?" "The doctors said she's stable," my mother said. Her voice was careful. "Measured. We just have to wait." Of course. A pause. The sound of a chair being pulled. "Where's the doctor now?" "Down the hall. He'll be back in an hour." Another pause, longer this time. I kept my breathing slow and even. I'd taken a yoga class 2 years ago for exactly 3 weeks before I quit, but right now I was using every single thing I remembered from it. Then my father-in-law spoke. I hadn't heard him come in. His voice was lower, and he was clearly talking to his wife, not to my mother. "She can't remember anything from before the impact. That's what the paramedic said." "Good," my mother-in-law said. One word. Just that one word, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "What about the car?" my mother-in-law continued. "Already handled." "And the other thing?" A pause. "Also handled." My mother's hand tightened on mine, almost imperceptibly, but I felt it. "We need her to sign the amendment before she talks to any attorneys," my mother-in-law said. "Once she's coherent enough, before anyone starts asking questions." "She'll sign," my father-in-law said. "She trusts him." And then my mother-in-law said something I will hear for the rest of my life. Quiet, almost bored. Like she was discussing a minor inconvenience rather than a human being she'd watched walk down an aisle 6 years ago. She always was too trusting. That was the problem from the beginning. "My name is Hazel. I'm a forensic accountant, which means I spend my professional life finding the money people try to hide. Hidden assets in divorce proceedings, inflated invoices in corporate fraud cases, shell companies that exist on paper and nowhere else. I am, in the most literal sense, someone whose entire job is noticing when the numbers don't add up. Which makes what happened to me either darkly ironic or entirely predictable, depending on how you look at it. I met my husband at a conference in Chicago. He was charming and funny, and he looked at me like I was the most interesting person in the room, which I later understood was a skill he'd been perfecting his entire life. We dated for 2 years. We got engaged on a Tuesday night in our apartment kitchen while I was making pasta, which I loved because it wasn't performative. It felt real. The wedding was beautiful. His family paid for most of it, which I now understand was not generosity, it was investment. My in-laws own a real estate development company that his grandfather built from nothing. By the time I married into the family, it was worth somewhere north of $40 million. I knew this. I was a forensic accountant. I knew exactly what I was marrying into, financially speaking. What I didn't know was that 6 months before our wedding, my husband's family had hired their own forensic accountant to figure out how to keep me from ever touching any of it. I didn't know that until I was lying in a hospital bed pretending to be unconscious. The prenuptial agreement. That's where this story really starts, even if it took me years to understand it. We signed it 4 weeks before the wedding. My husband presented it as a formality, something his family's attorney required. Standard language, nothing punitive. I was working 70-hour weeks on a major fraud case at the time. I was exhausted. I trusted him. Here's the thing I need you to understand about that, because I know what you're thinking. I know what I would have thought, sitting where you're sitting. She's a forensic accountant. She finds fraud for a living. How did she not read it? I did read it. I read the version he showed me. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing, was that the document I signed at the attorney's office was not the same document I'd reviewed at home. One clause had been changed. Clause 14, buried in a section about asset recapture and spousal income. The original language said that any assets I brought into the marriage remained solely mine in the event of separation. The signed version said the opposite. I know how that sounds. I'm a professional. I should have caught it. But I was in love, and they were counting on exactly that. The accident happened on a Wednesday morning in March. I was driving to a deposition downtown, the same route I took every week. A truck ran a red light at the intersection of Garfield and 5th and hit the driver's side of my car. I don't remember the impact. I don't remember anything between pulling out of the parking garage and waking up to the sound of that beeping. I had a concussion, 2 cracked ribs, and a fracture in my left wrist. The injuries were serious, but survivable. What they were not, I now understand, was accidental. The truck driver didn't have a commercial license. He'd been paid in cash the week before from an LLC my in-laws had registered in Delaware 18 months earlier. I didn't know any of this lying in that hospital bed. But I filed it away, all of it, the conversation, the phrases, the timing, in the same part of my brain I use when I'm staring at a spreadsheet that doesn't balance. Something was wrong. I didn't know what yet, but I knew. After my in-laws left, my mother leaned close to my ear. I heard them talking in the hallway, she whispered, before you woke up. They were talking about an amendment to the prenup, something about the clause covering your salary and your pension contributions. She squeezed my hand. Hazel, I don't know what's going on in this family, but I think you need to be very careful. I squeezed back. Call Renee, I said. Renee was my college roommate. She was also one of the best family law attorneys in the state. Tell her I need her here. Don't use my phone. Use yours. Don't tell my husband you called her. My mother nodded. She understood the tone. She'd heard it from me before, usually when I was describing a case. She left the room quietly, and I lay there in the white light, breathing slowly, cataloging everything. Renee arrived the next morning. By then, I had a clearer picture of my own injuries. A visit from a very sympathetic detective who told me the truck driver had fled the scene, and they were still looking for him, and a conversation with my husband that left me feeling like I'd swallowed something cold. He sat beside my bed and held my unbandaged hand and said all the right things. He was worried. He was relieved. He was going to sue whoever was responsible. He loved me so much. And I watched his face while he said it, and I thought about forensic accounting, about how the numbers always tell the truth even when the person presenting them doesn't, about how the most sophisticated fraud isn't the kind with obvious red flags. It's the kind that looks exactly like the real thing until you know exactly where to look. His face looked like love. I'd spent 6 years believing it was. That morning I wasn't sure of anything except this. I needed information before I made a single move. Renee came in while my husband was getting coffee. She sat down, crossed her legs, and looked at me with that calm efficiency she'd had since the age of 19. Tell me everything, she said, from the beginning. So I did. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the amendment they mentioned, they can't make you sign anything while you're incapacitated. You have the right to have independent counsel review any document before you put your name on it. If they present anything to you, you say you need your attorney present. You say nothing else. They'll push back. Let them. You're a patient in a hospital with a documented head injury. Any document signed under these circumstances is immediately challengeable. She paused. I need to get a copy of the original prenup, the one you signed. I have a copy at home in my filing cabinet. Gray binder, 3rd shelf. Is your husband in the house? He's been here every day. I'll send a courier with written authorization from you. We'll do this through proper channels. I don't want him to know we have it." She looked at me steadily. "How much do you remember about what you signed?" I told her about Clause 14, about the version I'd reviewed at home versus the version I'd signed at the office. I watched her expression carefully as I explained it, the same way I watch a client's face when I tell them what I've found. She didn't flinch, but something behind her eyes sharpened. "If that's true," she said slowly, "what you're describing is fraud." "I know," I said. "I find fraud for a living." I was discharged after 5 days. My husband drove me home. He carried my bag. He made soup from a can and set it on the nightstand and kissed my forehead and said, "I'm just so glad you're okay." I smiled and said, "Me too." That night, after he fell asleep, I lay in the dark and made a list in my head. Not an emotional list, a professional one. The kind I'd make at the beginning of a case. Evidence I needed, records to pull, discrepancies to document. The LLC in Delaware my mother had mentioned, which I'd quietly confirmed through my own professional database access before I left the hospital. The timing of its registration. The cash payments. The truck driver. I had spent 6 years being a wife. For the next few months, I was going to be an investigator. The first thing I found was the amendment itself. My in-laws brought it to the house 3 weeks after I got home, presented by their attorney with the warmth of a tax audit. It was framed as a routine update to the prenuptial terms. It contained 4 new clauses, each one more predatory than the last. The most significant revised the division of marital assets to exclude what they called passive income streams, which, I realized as I read it carefully, was specifically constructed to capture the pension contributions I'd made through my firm over the previous 6 years, currently valued at just under $290,000. I read every word. I read the footnotes. Then I set it down on the kitchen table and said, very pleasantly, "I'll need my attorney to review this before I sign anything." My mother-in-law's expression didn't change. "Of course," she said. "No rush." There was, I knew, enormous rush. But they didn't know I knew. Renee had a colleague who specialized in document forensics. He compared the prenup I'd signed against the original draft I'd kept in my email correspondence with the family's attorney. It took him 11 days to produce a report. The report confirmed that Clause 14 had been altered after my review but before the signing appointment. The alteration was made digitally, with metadata indicating it had been modified by a user account registered to the family's law firm 4 days before I signed. The attorney who managed the edit had since left that firm. He was, we discovered, currently employed by a subsidiary of my in-laws' development company. Renee walked me through the report over the phone while I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Whole Foods because I'd started taking all my important calls away from the house. "This is enough for a lawsuit," she said. "Fraud in the execution of a contract. The prenup is potentially voidable in its entirety." "If the prenup is void," I said, "what does that mean for asset division?" "It means Illinois default law applies, which means you're entitled to an equitable share of all marital assets accumulated during the marriage." A pause. "Hazel, how long have you been married?" 6 years. "And you've been working the entire time?" "Full salary, every year." She didn't say anything, but I heard the calculation in her silence. "What about the accident?" I asked. "The Delaware LLC?" "That's a separate matter. Potentially criminal. I've already had a conversation with someone at the state attorney's office. They want to talk to you." Another pause. "This is bigger than a divorce case." I sat in that parking lot for a long time after I hung up. A woman walked past my car with 2 kids and a cart full of groceries, and she was laughing at something one of them said, and I watched her and felt something I couldn't quite name. Not jealousy, something closer to grief. For the version of my life I'd believed I was living. Then I started my car and drove home because there was still work to do. I will not describe in detail the months that followed because some of it is still in process and my attorney has opinions about what I should say publicly. What I can tell you is this. The prenuptial agreement was challenged and ultimately deemed unenforceable due to fraud in the execution. The Delaware LLC was traced through 3 layers of intermediary accounts to a management company controlled by my father-in-law. The truck driver was located in Indiana. The state attorney's office is handling what comes next. My husband and I are no longer together. He did not fight the divorce with any real conviction, which told me something I'd already suspected, that he'd known at some level that the ground he was standing on was not solid. We had a brief conversation in a mediator's office in which he said he was sorry, and I looked at him and tried to find the person I'd spent 6 years sleeping next to, and I couldn't. Not because he'd disappeared, but because I finally understood that who I thought he was and who he actually was had never been the same person. "I know," I said, and then I stood up and left. I kept the house. I know that's a small detail in a story with attempted vehicular fraud and avoidable prenuptial agreement and a Delaware shell company, but I want to tell you that because it was important to me. My mother helped me repaint the living room on a Saturday in October. We used a color called Dusty Sage, which I picked out because it had nothing to do with anything from before. My mother-in-law sent me a letter 2 weeks after the mediation concluded. I didn't open it. I handed it to Renee's office unopened because it qualified as potential evidence and also because I genuinely did not want to know what was in it. I started a new case the following Monday. A restaurant chain in the suburbs suspected insurance fraud. The numbers were a miss, and the paper trail was deliberately complicated. And when I sat down with the files and started finding the places where the math didn't add up, I felt not happy, exactly, but present, sharp, like the version of myself I'd had to work very hard to remember I still was. There is something people say when they hear this story, or a version of it. They say, "How did you not see it?" And I understand why they ask. I'm a forensic accountant. I find fraud. I should have known. But here is what I know now that I didn't know then. Fraud doesn't announce itself, not the sophisticated kind. It hides inside the things you trust most. It uses your love and your exhaustion and your belief that the person across from you is telling the truth. The most effective deception isn't the kind that looks wrong. It's the kind that looks exactly right until the moment it doesn't. I believed my marriage was real, and for a long time, I think parts of it were. That's the part that doesn't fit neatly into the story, the part I'm still sitting with. My mother called me on a Wednesday evening in November just to talk. We ended up on the phone for 2 hours. At some point she said, "You know what I keep thinking about? That day in the hospital. How fast you figured out what to do." I thought about it, the beeping, the fluorescent light. Her hand over mine, one small shake of her head. "I had a good teacher," I said. She laughed. And in that moment, in the kitchen of my repainted house with the case files spread across the table and the life I was slowly rebuilding arranged around me, I thought, this is what solid ground actually feels like, not the version I was sold, the real thing. I knew the difference now. I used to think that being smart was enough protection, that knowing how numbers worked, knowing how deception hid inside clean-looking documents, meant I was somehow immune to being deceived myself. It took a hospital ceiling and the sound of my mother-in-law's voice, calm, almost bored, to show me how wrong I was about that. What happened to me wasn't random, and I don't mean that in a fatalistic way. I mean it in the most practical sense. Every outcome in that situation was the direct result of choices made, by them and by me. They chose to alter a legal document. They chose to use my trust as a tool. They chose to involve another person in something that could have killed me. And those choices, stacked on top of each other over years, created a weight that eventually collapsed on all of them. That's not justice in some abstract cosmic sense. That's just how consequences work when you build something on a false foundation. But I have to be honest about my own part in it too. I signed a document under pressure without independent review. I let exhaustion and love override the professional instincts I'd spent a decade developing. I told myself that trust meant not verifying when really trust and verification were never opposites. They just felt that way when you were in love and didn't want to see what you might find. The thing that saved me, and I've thought about this a lot, wasn't my credentials. It was my mother's hand over mine in that hospital room. The one small shake of her head that gave me time to think before I reacted. Integrity, I've come to believe, isn't something you perform for other people. It's the thing that holds you together when everything around you is designed to make you fall apart. My mother had it. Renee had it. And somewhere underneath all the grief and shock and anger, I still had it too. That's what let me walk out of that mediator's office and keep going. I also learned something about the difference between cleverness and real intelligence. I was clever enough to understand the fraud once I saw it. But real intelligence, the kind that actually protects you, means slowing down even when everything is moving fast. It means asking the question you're afraid of the answer to. It means not mistaking someone's warmth for their character. And then there's the part nobody really talks about in these kinds of stories, what it costs to keep going. To go back to work on a Monday morning when your personal life is being dismantled in a lawyer's office, to repaint a room and call it a new beginning without pretending the old one didn't matter, that kind of persistence isn't dramatic. There's no single moment where it kicks in. It's just a decision you make again and again, quietly in the ordinary hours of ordinary days. I'm still making it.